delighted to welcome and introduce Professor Mark Lilla. Mark is an American political scientist and historian of ideas, journalist, and professor of humanities at Columbia University in New York City. A frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and publications worldwide. He is best known for his books, The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics, The Reckless Mind, Intellectuals in Politics, The Stillborn God, Religion, Politics in the Modern West, and The Shipwrecked Mind, on Political Reaction. After holding professorships at New York University and the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, he joined Columbia University in 2007 as professor of the Humanities. He lectures widely and has delivered the Weizmann Memorial Lecture in Israel, the Carlisle Lectures at Oxford University, and the Macmillan Lectures on Religion, Politics, and Society at Yale University. His remarks today are entitled Tocqueville on Inclusion. Please join me in welcoming Mark Lilla.
Thanks, Brandon. I want to make sure everyone hears me. There were some problems this morning. Okay, good. Today's conference is devoted to exploring theological perspectives on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was reassured this morning to see that everyone was aiming higher than contemporary partisan discourse about this subject. We've been invited to take these concepts seriously in their own right, which is what I intend to do. I do have one problem, though, which is that my license to practice theology was revoked about 10 years ago. And despite years of litigation and mounting legal bills, I somehow can't get it back. So that's to warn you that my contribution is going to be more modest than those of the other participants. Instead of theology, I'll be exploring the political psychology of inclusion by taking a fresh look at democracy in America. Sorry. I've been teaching this book for a very, very long time. But only in recent years have I come to appreciate some of Tocqueville's deepest assumptions and their implications. And in particular, I've been thinking about the opening 2 paragraphs of the book. I'd always rushed past them since they seemed anodyne to me. But Tocqueville is the kind of writer who mastered the art of making the boldest of claims in an offhanded way. These paragraphs are far more radical than might first appear and offer a way to start thinking about the issues that we're discussing today. And they encourage me to put forward the following thesis: that the feeling of inclusion, the psychological feeling of inclusion, properly understood, is the first and most necessary condition of the entire democratic experiment. So let me refresh your memory of the book's opening. Of all the novel things which attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, none struck me more forcibly than the equality of conditions. I had no difficulty in discovering the extraordinary influence this fundamental fact exerts upon the progress of society. It sets up a particular direction to public attitudes, a certain style to the laws, fresh guidelines to governing authorities, and distinctive habits to those governed. Soon, I came to recognize that this very fact extends its influence well beyond political custom and law. It exercises no less power over civil society than it does the government. It forms opinion, and here I'll emphasize, creates feelings, proposes ways of acting, and transform anything that it does not directly instigate itself. Consequently, the more I studied American society, the more I saw in the equality of conditions the generating fact from which all others seem derived. And I found it before me constantly as a point at which all my observations came to an end. I emphasize a number of words and phrases here for a reason. Let's begin with this unusual phrase, generating fact. It sounds strange even in French, but Tocqueville puts a great deal of weight on it. Right up front, he announces his conviction that brute material facts can generate non-material facts, most importantly, human feelings. Les sentiments play a key role in Tocqueville's entire political theory. He believed that human emotions act as a kind of connective tissue between the conditions under which people live and the principles that they hold to be true. That the link is through feeling. So against the Marxists, he did not think that material conditions automatically generate states of consciousness. And against some Enlightenment thinkers, he did not think that ideas alone generate states of affairs. One novelty of democracy in America at the time was that it avoided these materialist and idealist mistakes by focusing attention on the psychodynamics of democratic society. The generating fact Tocqueville first mentions is equality of condition, a phrase that we'll have to unpack. In order to appreciate it, we need to appreciate how very different Tocqueville believed aristocratic societies would be from the new democratic ones that he foresees. As his book opens, Tocqueville presents aristocratic society as an archipelago of mini societies with different classes of people living in them. The aristocratic military class, the priestly class, the clerical class, the merchant class, the servant class, and then the peasants. The inhabitants of these different islands face different material conditions on those islands, but on each of them there was a sense of inclusion and mutual recognition of others who faced the same conditions. And related to those different sets of conditions were different sets of emotions. Let's consider this passage. The aristocratic constitution has no less an influence upon servants' ideas and habits than it does upon those of their masters. And although the effects are different, it is easy to recognize the same cause. The men whose fate it is to obey doubtless have no understanding of fame, virtue, honesty, and honor in the same way as their masters, but they have derived a servant's reputation, virtues, and honesty, and they have conceived, if I may put it so, a sort of servile honor. A second passage. When all the members of a community are almost equal, and all men have almost the same way of thinking and feeling, each one of them can judge in a flash the feelings of the others. All he needs to do is to cast a quick glance at himself. Now, the destiny of the United States was to be different. There were at the beginning no pre-existing islands of privilege among the white population, thinking, and feeling. Instead, the earliest Americans faced the same rough set of opportunities and challenges posed by their new environment. This idea of a set of challenges and opportunities, I think, is what he means by equality of condition. The land was vast, rich, and sparsely populated. It was also wild and untamed, which meant that securing the basic necessities for living was difficult for everyone, not just one class. And as settlement moved west and families found themselves far from East Coast settlements, they had to learn the art of self-government for themselves. They were, in an almost unimaginable way today, if not perfectly, starting over. That task was made much easier, in Tocqueville's view, by another kind of equal condition, ethnic and religious homogeneity. He places great emphasis on the Anglo-Protestant cultural heritage of the first settlers, which prized religious liberty and carried with it a shared stock of concepts, principles, and vocabulary for engaging with each other in politics. Paradoxically, it would turn out that a certain kind of homogeneity in early America helped eventually give birth to principles that are today employed to defend diversity. In any case, it was all these similarities that Tocqueville grouped under the term equality of condition. He didn't mean absolute equality of wealth or anything like that. And from his observation of this one fact, he drew two very important conclusions. The first was that since different human feelings are generated by different material conditions, those feelings should be considered brute facts as solid as the conditions themselves. Therefore, the set of dominant emotions arising from the equality of conditions in democracies are crucial givens so long as those conditions hold. Secondly, since the equality of conditions toward which modern societies are tending is, in his view, historically novel, so we should expect to see novel democratic feelings being born in the human heart. He believed there was a history of human feeling that develops and generates new states of emotional affairs. This is what Tocqueville attempts to document in the brilliant and very funny, often second volume of Democracy of America, by giving a micro-history of democratic feelings. So what are the implications of these two conclusions? If he's right, I think, we can add one more conclusion to the pile. If American democracy rests on the bedrock of brute factual similarity, similar challenges in life, similar aspirations, similar habits and ideas, then the emotional weather of the regime, so to speak, will depend on the degree to which similarity exists and is felt to exist. If it changes, if citizens feel they belong to separate realities, if a part of the population feels excluded from the lives of other sorts, we should not be surprised if it sets off an emotional storm, just as a factual matter. Now, Tocqueville is nothing but bold. His entire analysis of modern democracy rests on brute facts, like an inverted pyramid. American democracy does not rest ultimately on the principles of liberty and equality, as so many patriotic interpreters have assumed, nor does it rest ultimately on shared religious beliefs, as his pious interpreters believe. It rests instead on a lucky break. The roughly similar material conditions that the first roughly similar settlers faced when they landed naturally gave rise to feelings of inclusion and the experience of mutual recognition, which spread throughout the entire society, not just on separate islands in an archipelago. And to follow my earlier metaphor, American society gave rise to new emotional weather patterns that affect the whole of society, and he believes we can expect that of other democracies. And so people's feelings about democratic inclusion should be taken seriously as a barometer of social health. Now, as this audience needs little reminding, Tocqueville's observations about the importance of sameness and inclusion were not original to him, though his application of them to modern democracy was. In the Western tradition, thinking about the political significance of inclusion and mutual recognition began with Aristotle. And then it was elaborated in the Christian Middle Ages and continues to play a role in Catholic theology. Aristotle coined a useful term for this sentiment of inclusion. He called it civic friendship. This is how he puts it in the Nicomachean Ethics. States, it seems, are maintained by friendship. And legislators are more zealous about that than about justice. Legislators most of all wish to encourage concord and expel discord as an enemy of the state. The implication being that without concord, your likelihood of establishing justice, and more importantly, people feeling that they're being treated justly, diminishes or increases the more the concord there is. Now, there are different sources of concord in any society, but they all depend on a mutual recognition of belonging. Those who were granted Athenian citizenship recognized each other as belonging to the class that directed political affairs, whatever inequalities of wealth existed between them. In fact, the most consequential citizen of Athens, Socrates, was a relatively poor man. The ideal of Christian society also depends on a form of inclusion called fraternity. It sets a higher standard of inclusion by teaching us to recognize Christ and his suffering in all our fellow human beings, whether they be fellow citizens or not. As then Cardinal Ratzinger put it in his book Christian Brotherhood in 1993, "My neighbor is the first man I meet who is in need. For, as such, he is simply a brother of the Master who is always present to me in the loneliness of men." So the mutual recognition on this view passes through brotherhood with Christ. Even modern theorists of socialism believe that the success of the revolution would depend on the mutual emotional recognition among individual workers, that they shared a destiny as both the victims and potential conquerors of capitalism. We still see traces of this notion in the union movement. The full name of the Teamsters Union, if you don't know, is actually the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. But gestures like wearing a Teamsters jacket or contributing to a charity for the homeless are not sufficient to sustain feeling in a democratic society. In Tocqueville's view, the feelings must somehow be engaged in the experience. and then be widely shared. This is how he puts it. The thing which keeps a majority of citizens under the same government is much less the rational decision to remain united than the instinctive and, in a sense, unconscious agreement resulting from like feelings and similar opinions. Now, what he has in mind here has nothing to do with an aspiration to Christian virtue or the moral principle of equality or appeals to a contrived notion of reflective civic patriotism. He's not interested here in principles. He's referring to a factual reality, a brute fact of congruence in the feelings of citizens and their general outlook on the world. Either it's there or it isn't. I think there are still texts in which a basic congruence of feeling and outlook among Americans becomes apparent, even in times like our own. For example, when Americans leave the country and encounter each other. Perhaps some of you here today have had the experience I'm about to describe. Imagine you've been spending a few years in a foreign country whose language you've learned and whose customs you've gotten used to. One day you find yourself in a restaurant seated next to a group of loud and garrulous American tourists whose conversation you can't help but overhear. Suddenly you feel yourself beamed into a psychological and moral universe you only dimly remember. In it, everyone is open, even confessional in their speech. They all believe their opinions are as good as anyone else's, including those of so-called experts. Self-doubt and irony have fled the room, driven out by an almost oppressive bonhomie. And the poor waiter has been asked for his first name and is informed that these new friends from downstate Illinois will be staying in touch. How do you, the American observer, feel once they've left? Well, if you've been having a bad time in the country, the foreign country, the sound of familiar voices might come as a welcome respite from the rudeness of the French or the humorlessness of the Germans. You might feel an urge to pull up a chair and join, knowing that you would be welcomed into the conversation on a first-name basis, which would not be unfamiliar to you. If you've had too much to drink, you might even share your email address with them at the end of the evening. But what if you are a graduate student straining to fit into this foreign culture and not appear American? You refuse to speak English, you ape the gestures and demeanor of those around you, you buy clothes that won't make you stand out. So what are you feeling as you stick your head more deeply into your copy of Le Monde and pray that the tourists leave soon? Well, you are experiencing exactly the same set of feelings as the first American I described, just with a negative valence. You both recognize yourselves in your fellow citizens and feel implicated in their behavior. Some inner string vibrates at the same frequency as those of these intruders, whether you wish it or not. If you, the graduate student, had truly succeeded in remaking yourself as a member of this foreign country, foreign society, the behavior of these Yanks would be a matter of indifference to you, or at most of amusement. But what they do and how they behave matters to you emotionally. It somehow reflects on you because you instinctively feel your life is entangled with theirs for better or worse. These, alas, are the political friends that you've been saddled with. Now, from the Russian Revolution down to 1989, Europeans debated the question, why is there no socialism in the United States? After all, the economic inequalities were glaring, as were states of domination. The question was badly put, of course, since it assumed that some necessary historical process had inexplicably bypassed America, when in fact no such process existed. A better and more general question would have been this: what other forms of inclusion exist in the United States to provide Americans with a sufficient amount of fellow feeling to keep them attached to the regime and each other despite inequalities? What still makes them feel like they belong? In retrospect, we can see that the Second World War left the country with a greater congruence of feeling than had existed in the 1930s, because Americans in all walks of life had shared a common experience and somewhat similar conditions. One consequence of that greater moral congruence was the desegregation of the American military in 1948, shortly after the war. Then, in the subsequent 2 decades, prosperity allowed whole segments of the population to participate in a new consumer economy and to feel it served them. It provided not only the basics of food, shelter, and employment, it also gave them access to what had once been luxuries for a few. Things we take for granted now, like being able to take an annual vacation, or having enough money to pay for a daughter's wedding. These things were for the first time within the reach of ordinary workers. These were signs of belonging that boosted people's sense of dignity. Socialists at the time recognized what was going on, and they condemned it. The trinkets of the shopping mall were a ruse that only bought off the loyalty of the working classes at bargain prices. Rather than storm the factory, they instead lined up in the dead of night on Thanksgiving to storm Best Buy on Black Friday. Theodore Adorno wept. But most Americans didn't see the situation in this dark way. They did not speak the socialist language of class antagonism and material inequality, though perhaps they should have and still should. Instead, it was sufficient that they felt included, that they had access to some things, or Erzat's version of those things, that the well-off also had access to. Anyone can belly up to a blackjack table in Las Vegas and play. Bankers and nurses alike. Welcome to the club. Your money's good here. That's not the feeling one gets at Monte Carlo. Now, as you'll quickly discover, I don't have anything original to say about the causes of the widening class divide in contemporary America. I would like to emphasize, though, 2 unoriginal points that we should bear in mind when discussing the political psychology of inclusion today. I don't think any of us would deny that the feelings of democratic belonging have diminished rapidly in our contemporary democracies, for all the reasons we discuss daily. And this is not only true in the United States. I also think it doesn't have entirely to do with economics or even the internet, at least not directly. Instead, a more complex cultural gap has opened up in our democracies that we are finding much harder to bridge. Tocqueville made one more subtle observation in Democracy in America that might help us think this through. He wrote, "If 2 men belonging to the same society have the same interests and to some extent the same opinions, but their characters, education, and style of living are different, it's highly likely that they will not see eye to eye. People with the same material interests, even same opinions, won't get along. Tocqueville was referring to a significant difference he had observed between Southerners and Northerners on his travels. Even if he found himself speaking to people of roughly the same class, with roughly the same economic interests, their character, education, and styles of living were so different due to slavery that mutual recognition and political friendship between white Northerners and Southerners was difficult and would soon prove impossible. Today, the cultural gap is not a function of geography. It's a function of education. The demands of the contemporary economy are such that a certain level of education, basically a bachelor's degree, is required even to imagine advancing significantly in society. And yet, only a little more than a third of adult Americans have such a degree. We may forget that in our little university and urban cocoons, but we should remind ourselves of it as often as we can. To test myself in preparation for this talk, I looked up the percentage of Manhattanites with a college degree, which I assumed to be maybe 40 to 50%, discovered it to be 70%. And it was only 23% in the Bronx. I had no idea. The consequences of this gap are not just economic. It's not just material inequality that obviously arises from this. The college experience does more than provide training for entering lucrative positions and professions. It also socializes students in new styles of living, to use Tocqueville's phrase, that are vastly different from those of the less educated. Graduates come out of the university with very different ideas about how to comport themselves in public and at work, what to eat, how to entertain themselves, how many children to have and how to raise them, how to manage money, and how to take care of their health. Even the typical bodies of our two large cultural classes today are notably different. Recently, the term caste has been thrown around rather promiscuously, but frankly, I can't think of a better one to describe the seriousness of our new cultural gap. If Tocqueville was right that extremely different styles of living can set apart even people who have shared economic and political interests, then we're in trouble. A widely shared sense of exclusion, with all the attendant emotions of shame and resentment, is toxic in a democracy. And it is even more threatening if the prerequisites of inclusion are further and further out of reach. Ironically, if exclusion were only a matter of money, then we could distribute it. Or people would think that they would have a chance of striking it richer later in life. They would still feel part of the game. But no one strikes it smart later in life. And even if they did, the bridge into the educated class is extremely narrow, and it shuts after adolescence. So how is one to establish or reestablish political friendship in a worsening situation? I have little idea, since it is not a matter of changing hearts and minds through sermons, speeches, and education, nor does it depend on perfecting our philosophical or theological arguments. The problem is that we're living with a new brute generating fact that is triggering new feelings of distrust, contempt, shame, defensiveness, resentment, antipathy, and withdrawal. A large class of white Americans is experiencing for the first time a range of emotions that American minorities, especially Black Americans, have always had to contend with on a far vaster and much deeper scale. That is why, over the past few years, I've come to take very seriously the expressed need to feel included, to see people who look and talk like me, beginning in our educational establishments. In a book I wrote a few years ago, I treated such expressions of feeling excluded or seeing people who look and talk like me as divisive, on the grounds that group identities can block people from recognizing the wider common good that affects their lives and which they have to bond together in order to address. That can be true. But it is more true of emphasizing the principle of diversity than the principle of inclusion. There is, I think, a tension between the ideals of diversity and inclusion, since the former, diversity, is centrifugal, in effect, and the latter is centripetal. But I also know, as you know, that the feelings of exclusion in America today extend beyond minority groups. The white working class feels it, the religious population feels it, the South feels it. Our common sense of mutual recognition is melting away, and we really have no idea how to stop it. It's for a number of deep reasons, notably the different material conditions under which people labor and the growing differences in character, education, and styles of living that derive from these conditions. The crisis of inclusion extends far beyond our elite spats over college admission and corporate hiring. In preparing this talk, I did my best to come up with an example of an institution in American life that still does a good job of making Americans from different walks of life, and especially different levels of education, feel included and recognize each other. And the only example I could come up with was college sports. And that for a somewhat personal reason. My late father never attended college, but was a sports fan and had developed a vicarious attachment to the University of Michigan. The day I was admitted to the university was the second happiest day of his life. The happiest day being the day he saw the team win the Rose Bowl. After he was widowed, he came to visit me every weekend, and we would go to games together. Football, basketball, hockey. He started buying up paraphernalia, and soon everything in his house was covered in maize blue. But the significance of the experience for him was not simply in watching university sports. It was that when we crossed campus together, he felt at home. He knew the streets, he knew the buildings. He felt somehow that it was his place, even though he'd never been a student there, and that he felt welcome there, even without a degree. And it certainly made him more willing to pay taxes for the university. I'm sure he wasn't alone. Most universities in the world and other countries are closed institutions treated with indifference or hostility by the working people who live near where they're located. This is not the case in America. Now, I recount this anecdote not to give a coach's pep talk about how life is like football. Quite the contrary. I'm simply saddened and a little shocked to discover that I couldn't think of a single other institution in American life that manages to put people from different educational classes together in a setting where they felt included and recognized each other. And even then, I'm not sure it's working. When I attended an Ohio State game last year, I marveled once again at the class diversity of the crowd and the palpable sense of friendship among those who attended. But as I left and I walked past the cars in the parking lot when the game was over, I saw nothing but bumper stickers expressing hate or contempt for fellow citizens who didn't share the owner's political outlook. What happens in the stadium stays in the stadium, I guess. In short, we are in a very bad way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Now it's time for audience questions. So would anyone like to lead off?
First of all, thank you, Professor, and I apologize in advance because I have to start off with questions to an amazing talk, and probably I will not be up to the level, even with just asking my question. But your talk made me remember of what my PhD supervisor in Italy told me once. The Italians, never existed, someone said, because we were very different from every region. But he said there was soccer united them, and then TV, national TV, and the third being the war, right? So these three things were the only thing that did something. What comes to mind, and might be very controversial, maybe within this crowd, as a fan of the freedom of education that exists in this country, I also have to say that there might be something good about the mandatory uniform curricula that exist, in my home country, in Italy, which create a cultural capital that is shared. There is no Italian student that doesn't read Dante. There is no Italian student that doesn't know something about Renaissance and Gothic art. And that, I would assume, unites us when we go visit Paris. And we can all look at something and remember, no matter what the background is. So I know this is a hard question, but what is your position, or what would you argue regarding having a different core curriculum for schools from way before college?
Right. Let me ask a question, though, just to be precise. I know what you're saying is true of the liceo level in high school. How deep does it go down into the primary schools?
Very deep.
Very deep.
Primary schools up until 14, all schools are equal.
No, I mean in terms of this core curriculum.
Yeah. Up until 14, there is very little freedom for parents to choose.
Yeah.
Almost nothing.
Yeah. Well, as someone who taught at the University of Chicago and has taught in the core program at Columbia, you're singing a song that I recognize and stirs me. And it actually reminds one that one can do a lot more at the earlier grades than we do. Yeah, we can demand much more of our students. Instead, basically, American primary and secondary education is about teaching you to be a good American, being able to work together. There's no problem in failing a class that no one does anymore. What's really damning on a report card is does not play well with others, which I saw more than once on my report cards. So our schools are about something else, I just feel. And, I've spent enough time living in Italy and in France and in Germany to feel that Europe gets primary and secondary education completely right, and the US gets gives university education right, where in Europe it's a disaster, relatively, on continental Europe. So certainly I feel that that would be important. We don't have a text like Dante, because there isn't an text for us that's not perhaps a political text. But one can imagine adopting something like this, a shorter text. I mean, someone pretty young can read and understand Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, for example, right? There are things like that. So, but the task of making Americans is something that everyone feels in a way that you don't in Italy, right? Yes, it's true that, there was this process of making Italians out of people from all the regions, Siciliani and all the rest. But there's a shared language. They share the church, which is huge, right? So in my dream America, I would like to do this. My sense of the possibility of that happening is not very encouraging, I'm afraid to say, which is why I sent my daughter to a French school for her lower schooling, and then she went to an American university.
I'm going to ask a quick question. So if equality of conditions gives rise to the feeling of inclusion, in your remarks, you focused on growing inequality of conditions by class. You also made reference to inequality of conditions historically and up to the present by race. But the main feelings of exclusion that exist in our society today are by race and by partisanship, and not by class, at least not in an articulate or explicit way. Or perhaps you disagree, but so what is your comment on that? Like, do you agree? And if so, what would your analysis of that be?
I haven't thought about it in just those terms, I have to admit. Because one, I think the feeling of political exclusion is pretty tied to class differences in the way I spoke of differences of habits of life and all the rest. There's a big gap there. Right? And it's a big gap in education, right? So I think those things are more significant. And I would think of the sense of political exclusion as being a function of these other differences that are widening in our society, and not as being primary. I mean, when I talk about class, I'm not limiting myself to material conditions, but a whole social sphere that you live in with different norms, different habits, different food, all that really separates people. Charles Murray wrote a book a long time ago called maybe Common Ground, was that it? And he pointed out that throughout most of American history, American presidents ate the same food and entertained themselves in ways that were very similar to the average American. Up through the 1950s, they were living on meatloaf and canned peas, which may explain some of our political conflicts and the anemia of American leadership. I don't know. But with the election of Bill Clinton, that started changing, right? And then Barack Obama brewed beer in the basement of the White House and so on. And so you've seen arise very visibly this gap in the way people talk about themselves, think about the education of their children, think about managing money. It's one of the huge gaps, especially for minorities, is to learn how to manage your money, right? And manage your health. So these are permutations of this growing separation, and it's why I'm pessimistic about our, short of a national crisis that brings people together, that us sewing ourselves back together, if the gap is a function of education styles of living.
So thinking about de Tocqueville and the feeling of inclusion, which is closely connected to equality of conditions, and since we're here at a conference sponsored by the Catholic Chaplaincy, I couldn't help but recall that de Tocqueville, in some of his chapters, gets kind of extensive into more, how different religions relate to the conditions in America. And he talks about how, I can't remember the exact context, but Protestantism, Protestant Christianity, actually tends not to help sort of this sense of universal equality. Its instinctive feeling is the sense for independence. Yeah. Whereas Catholicism, actually, its instinctive sentiment is, at least socially, the sentiment of equality. Yeah. So I don't know if knowing what you know about Tocqueville, which is deeper than I do, but commenting on how perhaps in our days, somehow that the Catholic Church in this country, I don't know how familiar you are with what it does now or its history, could somehow kind of help the spread the sentiment of the feeling of inclusion through its resources, as through how Tocqueville sees them. I mean, personally, I know that Catholics are aware that in the 1800s, certainly a lot of my great-grandparents or people's grandparents, who many of them arrived in that time, were greatly helped by the educational system that the church set up, and which effectively helped people integrate into the society and feel included, often people who were not Catholic. And I think of say, I don't know, Clarence Thomas, whatever you think of him, he became a Catholic, but when he went to one of these schools, actually I think he was raised Catholic, but he went to one of those schools, and at the school taught by the nuns, he felt like, and these were all, white women or whatever, Irish, Italians, but he's like, we all loved them. We were all, black students, but they were always on your side. And they always made you feel like that. And that really stuck with him. But that's just an example. So I don't know if you could speak to today, what resources that de Tocqueville sees in Catholicism can be useful in the current situation.
I'll preface my remarks by saying, from your lips to God's ears, when it comes to what Catholics will actually do in the world politically. Yeah? You're completely right about your account of Tocqueville's account of Protestantism, and maybe you remember there's this one very short chapter in Democracy in America where Tocqueville predicts that in future democratic societies will be full of atheists or Catholics. The reason being that the full development of the Protestant idea is just atheist freedom. Yeah, because it's focused entirely on liberty and the self and the individual. And so there will be kind of a saving remnant that will still feel a need to feel connected, not only to fellow citizens and fellow church members, but to feel connected to something higher. And so he saw both things happening. So he imagined that, yes, the Catholic Church will shrink in America, but it will become more fundamentalist, more fundamentally Catholic, while the rest of society becomes, well, if not atheist, just indifferent, live in a state of religious indifference. My concern about this, so on the one hand, I'm extremely encouraged, on the one hand, by the development of all these Catholic centers, or some of them are ecumenical about universities, and there's a network, and Aquinas and Witherspoon are part of this sort of same constellation, that if the rediscovery of a Catholic life means things like fighting for equal educational opportunity in this country, it's to be welcomed. But there's another side to it. And you can see the two sides of the post-liberal Catholic community now in the two books that Patrick Janine wrote. The first book was consistent with what you were saying, what I've just said, about Catholics bringing a sense of inclusion and community. The second book is about seizing political power by becoming counselors of the mob, essentially. So that's a choice before you, and before all of you in this room who belongs to this world. Which will it be?
Mark, I appreciated your discussion of sort of inclusion and belonging in terms of race and in terms of class. One of the things that's struck me about the tenor of political debates in the last maybe 10 years, which I hadn't felt in the years previous. To be fair, I was younger then, so maybe I missed it, is the degree to which some of what might be called more of our kind of cultural debates, even culture war debates, are inflected with that sense of not only are you wrong, but you don't belong here. So there's sort of a question, I think of this, maybe the first time I saw this vividly was in the debates, I think it was in 2015 over the Indiana Religious Freedom Act, and some of the journalism around that time, someone going and finding a pizza place in South Bend or something in Indiana, Memories Pizza. And there was a question about whether, they would make pizzas for a gay wedding, and then sort of, the kind of the internet mob forming and going out. And so in my mind,
I can't believe any gay couple would be happy with pizza at their wedding. I'm sorry. I find it totally implausible.
This was noted by a number of other people as well. But in my mind, class differences and national differences can be assimilated over time. And kind of and lowered. The question of can Italians be Americans can get resolved over time and become not really a question anymore. The question of who belongs with thornier ideological questions, and if one group is allowed to feel like they belong, the other group can't be allowed to feel like they belong. That seems a little more intractable. So I guess my question to you is, do you find that to be a recent shift in our politics? And if so, does that fit into, is that actually a class difference or a kind of a political question of inclusion? Or is that something else? Okay. Have our ideological conflicts become divisions of who belongs and who does not just who is right and wrong?
Yes.
And if so, is that subsumed into political questions about political inclusion, questions about class, or is that distinct?
Yeah, very well put. Well, again, as I said earlier, at the moment I see the sense of political exclusion and the reality of it as an expression of a deeper kind of mutual exclusion between two large classes. And it's because of the subtle reasons Tocqueville mentions that differentiate classes, that it's not simply who has the money or the wealth to pass on, but in our society it comes along with entering a professional world, an educated world. Your horizon of different countries is different. All of these things change. And so, I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood in Detroit, so I remember living in that world, but that difference is sort of within me, which maybe makes it easier to deal with. But Now it's so much more extreme because there's both been a brutalization of habits and ways of living of working people in this country. Charles Murray pointed this out too, that in fact, it's the educated class that really, in their lives, express conservative values in what they do, as opposed to working people whose lives have become much more chaotic and broken up for all sorts of reasons. So, you frankly, you're in a situation where you have, to speak impartially, an uncouth population that hates an effete population. And that's turning Italians into Americans, if they're all in the working class, is child's play. How do you do this? That's the real entrenchment. For the first time, I've started to appreciate what Pierre Bourdieu is getting at in some of his books, if you know him, about all the things that come along with class differences. And so, if I don't know what news stations you all watch, but it's extremely rare to see a conservative on MSNBC, and extremely rare to see someone on the committed left on Fox News. But at CNN, they try to put together a panel for the election, right? And, you've got, what's his name? Vance, the black journalist, Van Jones, who's great. And then there are a couple of white women reporters. And then you have two conservative figures. And they even look different. One of these guys, former football players, got a neck like this. And, he just looks and speaks differently. And they simply have different ways of approaching, even posing political questions. And, they all do their best to get along. And if it weren't for the paycheck, though, I don't know how long they would last in a bar somewhere.
Thank you for your remarks. I found it very helpful. Never thought about the inclusion question, the way you presented it, and find it very, very gripping. So I want to ask you what you think, or how do you see in the hoping to be encouraging, I guess, or looking forward. I go back to the remarks in the book, really, by Richard Neuhaus, the Catholic moment. And sort of picking up also where that prior conversation about the Tocqueville and the Catholic presence back then. And when in '88, I think it was, I think it was '88. Could be wrong. He writes that this is the Catholic moment. Basically, Catholicism at the service of the needs of society. He's writing as a Lutheran. He was still a Lutheran, but he's writing, seeing a tradition that I guess he felt, and of course, he was on his way to becoming a Catholic, but still as a Lutheran, saying this is a way forward. But of course, he didn't come that way. And I was advanced that there are two reasons for that. One was, of course, the enormous problems that were coming, rather than all the sexual abuses and all this, which were just to create an enormous, demand on everything, sucking the air from anything that it could be positive, certainly in the Catholic circles, but in other places. But also the difficulty, the challenge for Catholics, because Catholics are quite divided. And I'll just end with this and let you comment on however you wish to comment, that especially in recent times, a discovery is one of the things that you heard or you read, but I'm a Catholic, but it really hit me when, you might say, as a new discovery, as a new old discovery, that a phrase that Neuhaus uses, talking about religion, to propose, never to impose, a way to really advance religion, that I realized, well, this actually comes from a Vatican II document, Dignitatis Humana, and I began to think about this precisely because thinking of the centrality of, in today's world, of the worthiness of the person. And so I said, wow, if I did not grasp this then, where it all comes from, and why is it has taken 60 years for me to figure that out, as sort of the magnitude of the problem in which we're stuck, even within the Catholic circles, and even, Catholic circles, I would consider myself somebody who knows something about Catholicism, they were stuck in something that divides us, but that it seems to have a tie-in to the point that you are bringing, that religion is not helping in helping us to feel included. At least that's kind of an elaboration. I would like to see how that sounds to you.
Yeah, well, I have to say I was so encouraged by the presentations this morning because I guess I had worried that it would mainly be, the strategy of a slap and a hug. So, DEI, slap, and then, but, human brotherhood, and slap again, and another hug. And instead, I almost felt as if the current situation has forced a kind of distillation of Catholic has forced certain Catholic thinkers today to be able to articulate what it is that connects us and what we are. That adversity, cultural adversity, may be bringing out greater clarity in the real foundations of human brotherhood, not just political friendship.
You told a very compelling story, and I found myself drawn into it, of a movement from a world of a sense of belonging, common shared material conditions, and shared feeling, to where we are today with this caste, education-based caste system. And it rang true for me in so many ways, but then I began to have some doubts, because as you acknowledged early on, in Tocqueville's America, there were many excluded, right? There were many who didn't belong and who did not share the same material conditions. And so in some sense, one could say, it's bleak today, but it was bleak then as well. And maybe in that bleakness, there's some hope as well. That is, there have always been multiple sites of shared feeling and belonging on many different fronts, many different grounds. People who share religion, people who share some cultural heritage. So we have many, many sites in this nation of belonging and togetherness, and those jostle up against one another, of course, in complicated ways, but they also create possibilities. So perhaps we're not just in a situation today in which we've got the educated and the uneducated, and there's no way that they can share a common sense of belonging. We've got people who belong in all sorts of ways. They aren't fans of the same sports teams and so on. So is it both in some sense bleaker, but in that by the same token, is there a possibility there that needs to be recognized in the multiplicity of forms and locations of belonging?
Yeah. Well, I can think two possible ways to think about this. Maybe there are more, but one of them is that what you're describing is the breakup of the United States into an archipelago society in which there are separate spheres of belonging, but not the belonging of in the whole that is necessary at the political level. Because at the political level, we determine what our principles are, political principles are, and how we act on them collectively. So there it's not just a question of, you belong to the, Quebec community in a country as opposed to another one. It's that in order to trust each other, to make political decisions, and to share the same principles, we have to actually recognize each other as citizens and feel included at that level.
Could I just say,
let me finish, please. The second way is that the way of belonging equally in America is that we all wear a team's sweatshirt. So the thing isn't that we wear different sweatshirts. It's that we all wear sweatshirts. So there is a way in which there's a diversity in this country that is a kind of superficial diversity where, you just eat a slightly different kind of food in one family than in another. But the idea that we have foods tied from cuisines that arose a long, long time ago, and even though members of your family have been American for several generations, there's still this sense of, I'm to talk that academic way, of performing diversity that isn't really deep and motivating. So I'm sorry, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very illuminating. I'm just contesting the breakup. I'm contesting the decline narrative. I don't think we ever had that because the enslaved were not part. They did not belong.
Yeah.
Women did not have a vote. There were groups that were excluded. So today there are also groups that maybe newly feel excluded. I think we still have the same challenges before us. So I just am contesting that there was a day, there was an era, there was a moment where we simply somehow had that and have lost it.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly barely old enough to remember when President Kennedy was shot, and the sense of hopefulness in this country that existed before that seemed to collapse in an afternoon. And the steady loss of that sense as the Vietnam War continued and the rest. Certainly in my lifetime, there's been a very big change. That is not to say that there were not some groups that were not included, but there are also different ways of being included, even for women. If your primary way of thinking about yourself is as a family unit and not as separate earners, then you are included as the wife and mother in a family. And that was questioned by people who weren't happy with it, and then it turned out lots of women weren't happy with it, and things changed. But there's no doubt that the atmosphere after World War II was completely different from that in the 1930s. Because we're talking about psychology, not just whether in some way that we can measure numerically that people were different. There was a sense that we're in the game. Even if, American life, as, our novelists tell us, is a kind of, it's like going to a betting parlor, right? And so there's a sense of everyone gets to go to the betting parlor. Some are going to walk out without their clothes on. Other ones are going to be wealthy. But we like our chances. So I would just contest your, to my mind, leveling of these moments and inattention to some really profound changes.
Thank you for a really thought-provoking talk. I was struck by your brief reference to Bourdieu and just wanted to follow up with that because as you were speaking about the different styles of life, Bourdieu is what came to mind for me and his analysis and distinction. I'm wanting to think about some of his talk about forms of capital and kind of exchanges between cultural capital, social capital, economic capital, and all of that. I'm thinking in your story, for instance, I'm assuming maybe that where you came from working class, it was cultural capital that got you then access to these other forms of social and economic capital. And I'm wondering if you could tell us in maybe your thoughts and maybe how Tocqueville might think about this, if we're thinking about how do we try to get out of this impasse where we are right now, would we start with the cultural capital? Do we start with the social capital? How do we, where is it that we work? Has something fundamentally changed in terms of the economic basis? In the analysis, kind of amongst those, what is most at issue and where would we even begin in terms of trying to link those differently?
Yeah, well, I think with the personal case, I don't think that these large forces explain personal cases, right? You need a very large group of people in order to make to be able to compare to other large groups how different they are. I was very different from my sister. I was very different from my neighbor. It was the same neighborhood, right? But I was the one who read and the other ones weren't the one who read. I'm not sure that, I know that can't be explained by us getting vastly different stocks of cultural capital because neither of my parents had been to college. So, I think individual cases are one thing, but the kind of things you're talking about from Bourdieu, I think are more and more relevant than when he was writing these things. But no, that's to an American eye because in France, these things were much more obvious. Right? I mean, whether you know how to cut the cheese at the cheese plate, if you get it wrong, immediately people can place you in a way that in England, someone can place your class like that with your accent. In France, it's little things like that, right? I don't know how else to respond, but to say that apart from the individual case, these are things that we ought to be thinking about and looking at and perhaps wringing our hands about because I don't know how to address those things.
Please join me in thanking Mark Lilla.